Kerry.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Ted Deutch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. And first, I'd like to thank you for your efforts on behalf of my constituent, Robert Levinson, on behalf of his family, who greatly appreciates your personal efforts and those of the State Department and so many in government. We hope you will continue to press for his release so he can come home safely to South Florida. I wanted to talk about sanctions a little bit and take some issue with your premise that we put sanctions in place to get to negotiation. I don't think that's why we put sanctions in place. We put sanctions in place to get to negotiation on our way to getting the Iranians to give up their nuclear weapons capability. That's where we were going. And the concern that a lot of us have, I think, is that if we don't set some marker, right? You asked us to work with you, we ask the same back. If we don't set some marker that says if you don't, if there is not a deal, and which we thought might come in 6 months, but the interim agreement now says the goal is to have it in 12 months. But if there's not a deal, then these additional sanctions that we passed during the summer, when many told us not to because Rouhani wouldn't even negotiate if we did. But if we should put those in place so it's clear what will happen if there's not a deal. And I do think that we can work with you on this. But if no one's suggesting that the legislation imposed those additional sanctions this afternoon. But if it's not 6 months because you need space, then let's figure out what it is. Is it 7 months? Is it 8 months? At some point, why wouldn't it be in our interest and the interest of our allies to make clear what will happen if the Iranians continue to push and extend and there is no deal? Why can't we work together in the interest of a negotiating position to help with diplomacy, to strengthen diplomacy in order to do that?
Congressman, we've made it clear to them what the implications are of not being successful. They know what the stakes are. And we have told them there will not be new sanctions of any kind imposed while we are negotiating. So if Congress votes for new sanctions, Congress is going off on its own, and it raises a question. Most importantly, I'm not as worried about how they interpret it as I am worried about how our allies, our friends, our partners interpret it. They're part of this. And if the United States sort of just lumbers off on its own and does its own thing when we are working with those partners, they have a right to say, we're in partnership. And
they do. They do, Mr. Secretary.
Well, let me just finish one thing, though. The other thing is, I've never suggested, I think at the beginning of my statement here, I told you that the reason, our whole policy is that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. So we're not in this for the sake of negotiations for negotiations' sake. We're here because those negotiations are to prevent them from getting the program. Obviously, I finished the sentence. But, if we don't negotiate, I think, in a way, I don't want to give them an excuse or any other rationale for upping the ante, changing the
I do. Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry, we're limited in time.
Let me ask you something. Let me ask you something. Yeah. Why is it, if they know they're listening to us now, they know there are going to be more sanctions. We've told them 100 times. What is wrong with our working together to tee up what we think might be appropriate if there is failure, and then do it?
Completely agree. I completely agree. We should tee it up, and we should tee it up with a date certain.
Doesn't mean passing it here now.
We should tee it up with a date certain, and if we all agree that at some date,
you can't have a date certain until you know how your negotiations are working. You don't want to make a presumption.
My concern is we've heard the argument before that sanctions undermine international unity. When the Senate voted unanimously on the Iranian central bank sanctions, it was the same day that the Department of Treasury sent a letter to every senator telling them not to vote for it. Not only did it pass unanimously, but it was vital in changing Iran's nuclear calculus and the world's approach to Iran because of the decision that they had to make about whether to do business with Iran or whether to do business with the United States. So I would like to work together to try to tee something up, as you said. I just have one other quick question. You said that oil sanctions continue as they are in place with no diminishment of oil sanctions. And yet the sanctions relief provides that 1 million barrels per day is now a fixed amount during the 6 months that the Iranians can export. And yet, under our existing sanctions, there needs to be a significant reduction in the amount that they can export. So it seems that there's a contradiction.
What we did, Congressman, is we put in place a pause for the few nations, China, India, South Korea, Japan. There are a number of nations who are working with us very closely in sanctions enforcement, who have been reducing their consumption of oil now over this period of time. And they have reached a point where it is very, very difficult for them to further reduce without serious impact on global economy and their economy. So in effect, we worked a way that we were able to release some of the money against giving them a pause for these 6 months because of that difficulty. Now, that's not a change in the sanctions regime. It's simply a pause in its application, but it still applies, and it will apply after the 6 months are over if we don't have an agreement.
We're going to need to go to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Elliott Engel, for your leadership, too. Mr.